There are places on the island of Sodor to which the engines cannot go. The region may be too remote, and the rails simply cannot reach. Or the ground might be unsafe for the engines to travel on. Sometimes, railway lines are built, but with time are forgotten, falling into disuse. On a railway as old as Topham Hatt, many such old lines exist, waiting to be rediscovered. One day, Thomas was at the fishing village, where he waited for his vans to be loaded with freshly caught fish. He used to hate pulling fish, but after Henry's accident, it became much more enjoyable, giving him an excuse to tease Henry when he met him at the harbor. But today, Thomas wasn't thinking about Henry, or the fish. He was focused on a set of rusty rails that led beyond the sidings. They seemed to wrap around the sea wall and vanish. Thomas had never noticed them before, but a storm had stripped away the brush which had previously hidden the rails from view.
"I wonder where they lead,"
said Thomas to his driver. "I don't know," he replied. "I was told that the coastal run ended at the fishing village. We'll have to ask Sir Topham Hatt." The next day, Thomas waited with Annie and Clarabelle at the bake station. Sir Topham Hatt was making his rounds when he spotted Thomas. "You're early," remarked Sir Topham Hatt. "To what I owe this pleasure?" Thomas gulped.
"Well, sir, my driver and I found an old set of tracks at the fishing village. We hoped you might know where they lead."
Sir Topham Hatt suddenly became very pensive. That's interesting, Thomas. But I haven't the slightest clue what rails you're talking about. I'm sure it's nothing. A mere oversight." He walked briskly away. Thomas felt deeply that Sir Topham Hatt was not being entirely truthful. Thomas asked the other engines about the old tracks, but he found no answers. Whenever he tried to broach the subject with Sir Topham Hatt, the topic was quickly changed. The situation was very perplexing to Thomas, not because there may be an old forgotten line, but that Sir Topham Hatt seemed so intent on avoiding the topic altogether. Eventually, Thomas lost patience. One day, he decided to take charge of the situation, his obsession with the old tracks overpowering his usual level-headedness. He spoke to the fish vans.
"Would you please bump me through the buffers at the end of a siding?"
Thomas asked. The vans, who were normally very well behaved, were so tired of hearing Thomas talk about the old tracks that they willingly agreed. Thomas usually ran around the vans to make his return journey to the harbor. As his driver began to move in, Thomas gave a loud which was the signal for the trucks to surge forward and bump into Thomas, sending him into the siding and through the buffers, the impact throwing Thomas's crew off the footplate. Thomas curved around the sea wall and down an overgrown part of the line, which stretched far back into the low-lying coastal regions. Broad trees stretched over the rails, blocking out the sun. Soon he came into a clearing, but to his shock, all the trees and plants were withering away, black with decay. Ahead, to his horror, Thomas saw that the track ended abruptly in an old shed. He wanted to stop, but he couldn't. His regulator had been left open, and he was gaining speed. He surged over an old level crossing and crashed through the back of the shed, coming to a grief in an old marsh. He was stranded. The water from the marsh doused Thomas's fire, and with his last few puffs of steam, he tried to whistle, but they quickly faded out. He looked around. There was no life to speak of. On a hill above, where he lay, he could see a small town, but the buildings looked abandoned and forlorn. He could make out mining and construction equipment through a dense fog over the marsh. But where was everybody? Thomas couldn't make sense of it, and felt that something terrible must have happened here. Soon, Thomas heard the sound of an engine behind him. It was Edward, with the breakdown crane. Sir Topham Hatt was on board. He and the crew all wore masks, and tread carefully on the ground. "I am disappointed in you, Thomas. Your curiosity got the better of you."
Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir,"
Thomas groaned. But what is this place?" A place I hoped never to return to. This was going to be the site of a state-of-the-art coal mine long ago. But the workmen kept finding pockets of noxious gas.
Is that what caused everything to decay?
Yes, it seeped into the water supply, poisoning this part of the island. Many people became sick. Edward remembers those days. Edward gave a knowing look. In hindsight, we should have torn up the rails altogether, but at the time it was too dangerous.
These things happened, I imagine,
Thomas said, as he was lifted back onto the rails.
Then why didn't you want to talk about the old mine? It's not as if this was all your fault.
Sir Topham Hatt cleared his throat. Thomas, I have been successful as the controller of this railway, but not every decision I have made has been a good one. I expedited the construction of this mine because the railway was in need of revenue. My hasty actions precluded a thorough inspection of the proposed mine shaft for safety, and the results are what you see here.
Thomas felt bad for Sir Topham Hatt. You were only looking out for the railway, Thomas said. Regardless of the outcome. That's something to be commended. I think it's also commendable that you've owned up to your mistake. I know I've made my fair share of my own. This is the second time I've derailed the mine. Soon, Thomas was dropped off at the works to be mended. Sir Topham Hatt smiled at the blue engine. Thomas, you've shown me that I still have something to learn from my engines, and I thank you. It is important to own up to your mistakes. I will remember that. We'll have to go on another adventure soon, Thomas joked. Sir Topham Hatt laughed. Oh, I think I'm finished with adventures for now, he replied. Between you, Toby, and Oliver, I've had quite enough. However, Gordon is due to take a late goods train tonight. With any luck, he'll stay on the main line.